Hello Unreal Engine games designers and developers. In today's episode we're going to look at multiplayer scoring. In particular we're going to look at displaying my score on the screen in this episode, and then in a follow-up we'll show how to use that foundation to show all player scores on the screen. So without any further ado, let's get started. Welcome back to the Desert Driving game series, and if this is the first video you've come across, then follow the playlist in the description below and you can catch up on all of the tutorials before we do today's, which is all about multiplayer scoring. So I've split this into two parts. Today's episode is going to be about creating my player score, and in the next video I'm going to talk about how to put out a multiplayer scoreboard. But a lot of what we do in this episode will provide a good foundation for adding the multiplayer scoreboard in the next one. So make sure that you complete this one before you go on to the part 2. With that being said, before we get on to the scoring, I'd like to just do a fix from last week's episode, and also a tweak as well. So if you remember last time, we had a problem with the gate spawner and we were getting this infinite loop detected, and I said that the problem was, if you look at the spawner covering the map here, if I go to the left view, you can see that I had to raise the gate spawner above the desert, and I said the problem was that the gates were spawning in the desert landscape. Now that wasn't wholly true. What was happening is the gates were spawning and the gate height was actually colliding with the gate spawner itself. So luckily there's a quick fix for that. If I edit the gate spawner, go to the gate spawner itself on the left hand side, and if you look at the collision, you'll notice that it was set up to allow generating overlap events. Well, this is just being used to ray trace to find a place for the gate to spawn. So let's get rid of all of this, generate overlap events, no, and particularly collision presets, no collision. And as long as you've now got it above the desert points, then this should be fine. You shouldn't get that infinite loop. So that was sort of my bad last time, but hopefully if you do this you'll never get that infinite loop issue. And also, while we're here, let's just reduce the size of the box spawner just for today, because I don't really want to have to be driving around the whole map to go through gates while I'm scoring. So we covered almost the whole map with this 45,000 by 45,000 box. Let's reduce it back to 5,000 by 5,000 and save that. And if you go back here, you'll see now it's go to perspective view, it's right in the middle of the map. Just means we don't have to drive around so much when we want to go through the gates and do our scoring. So scoring, we want to put my player score on the scoreboard, and the first thing we need to do is create a widget to display the score and show that on the player screen. So let's create a new folder at the top level called UI, and in that folder we will create user interface, a widget blueprint, and I'm going to call it w_my score. And this is going to be pretty simple. Open it up. I just want to put the text score and the score value there. So let's create a horizontal box in here. So let's go down to panels, horizontal box, and drag that in. And I want 2 text elements in that horizontal box. So drag down 2 text elements, and let's put it in the middle of the bottom of the screen. So go to my horizontal box, and in the anchors choose the bottom middle, zero out everything here, 0 0 0 0, and the alignment 0 on the x-axis and 1 on the y-axis. Okay. And now in our first text block we'll put score, and in the second one, we'll just put in 0 for now, but we'll bind it to a score variable in a moment. Okay, so let's go back to that horizontal box. Oh, sorry, I wanted to do 0 and 1, size to content. Okay, that's what I was missing there. So 0 on all the positions and sizes, 0 and 1 on the alignment, and then size to content. And you should have score 0 at the bottom. Let's give a bit of padding as well. So on the score text, let's put a padding value of 10, and same on the actual score itself. All right, that looks good. And now let's create a variable to store the score. So go to the graph and variables. We'll create a new variable. We'll call it player score, and this will be an integer value. Let's get rid of all of these events, and all we want to do is create an event here that allows the score to be updated. So let's create an event, custom event, and we'll call it update score. Add an input, score, which is an integer, and then all we want to do is set the player score variable here. So let's use Alt to drag that in, and literally that score will be put into the player score value. And the last thing we need to do is bind that score on the UI to this player score variable. So go back to the designer view, find our score here, and bind it to player score. And that's it as far as the widget's concerned. We shouldn't have to come back and do any more here. So let's close that down. And the next thing we need to do is to show that on the screen. So for that, we actually need a player controller. So far, we've got through the whole of this series without a custom player controller. We've done everything on the pickup vehicle. But now we want to create our own player controller. So before we do that, let's just create another new folder at the top level, and we'll call this player. We'll put everything player related in here. Open it up and create a new blueprint class, player controller, and we'll call it BP my player controller. And so we use this rather than the default player controller in the game. Go to your world settings and override this player controller class with this new BP my player controller. Okay, so open that up, and what we want to do is we want to go to the event graph, and on the begin play event we want to show this new score widget. So let's drag off here and do create widget. From the class, select that WMyScore widget that you created. We want to store this widget reference for later so that we can send the update score event to it. So go to return value and promote a variable, and we'll call that WMyScore so we can use it later. And so we've created the widget, but we haven't shown it on the screen yet. So the last thing we need to do is drag off the widget and do add to viewport. And that should show the score UI on all players when they start the game. So let's check if this works. Go to play mode. We'll go to 2-player mode, just make sure it's on the client as well as the listen server. Press play, and that looks pretty good. So let's just make sure it's on both. So the server shows the score widget and the client shows the score widget. So that's good. So we've now got the widget, and we've got the we've got it displayed when each player starts. So the next thing we need to do is, where are we going to store the score in multiplayer? If you're dealing with a we've got an error, and this always happens during these tutorials, and it's always good because it means I can explain what the issue is. It says here only local player controllers can be assigned to widgets, and that's because the player controller exists on both the server and the client. So in this begin play, we're creating the score widget we're trying to create the score widget on both the server player controller and the client player controller. So we need to check first of all that we're running on the local player controller, and to do that we will use the check is local player controller, and then use the B key to create a branch, drag it in here and say true. So effectively now we're only creating the score widget for local players only, for local clients only. It worked because it actually ran on the local player controller, but it got an error because it tried to do it on the server as well. So if I press play, it still displays score, but when I come out of play mode there's no more errors. So that was an important factor that I forgot to mention, is that we are making sure that UI widgets are only created on the local controller and not on the server, because they can't be created on the server. So as I said, we need to now start to think about where we're going to store the player score, I should say. And I'm going to show you a useful document that I came across. I'm going to put a link to this in the playlist. But there is this Unreal Engine 4 Network Compendium that's been created that talks all about network replication and what objects Unreal Engine 4 creates. And in particular, I'd recommend you read this anyway all the way through, but in particular on pages 9 and 10 they have these really useful diagrams that show you what objects are created and where they live. So the game mode, for example, lives on the server only. The player controller that we created lives on the server and on the client for the player who's using that controller. We have a game state that's on the server and client, and we have these player state objects that are created for each connected player. And if I go down another page, this is, I think, an even more useful visualization of those objects, because it shows which clients can see which objects. And you might be tempted, for example, to put the score on the player controller. And the only issue with that is that client 1 can see the score that's added. Even if you put it on the server, it's replicated between the server potentially and the player controller. But if client 2 wants to see client 1's score, it can't easily do that. However, they've usefully created this object called player state, and player state is shared between all of the clients as well as the server. So what we want to do is we want to store the score and manipulate the score on the server. That's a general truism, is that you always want to maintain the game state and anything to do with the trust of the game on the server. So we can update the player state on the server, and then we can replicate it to all of the clients so they can see the score. So player state is the object that we want to use. Now, interestingly, player state does have these variables at the moment. So it has score and items like that, but for some reason you cannot manipulate them in blueprints. You can manipulate them in C++. However, it's not a big issue, because we can create our own subclass of player state, and we can create our player score variable there. So with that being said, let's go back to our project, and we will go to the main window, and what we'll do now is we'll create our own custom player state. So in the player folder we will go to blueprint class, all classes, search for player state, select it, and we're going to call this BP my player state. And in the world settings, we want to override the default player state object with the new my player state. Now open that up, and what we want to do is create a player score variable that we can manipulate. So in the variable side, click on variable and type player score. Make sure it is an integer value, compile and save, and then you can set the default value. We'll set the default value at 0 for the beginning of the game. Okay, so that's the player state. Now what we want to do is we want to have a function that allows the score to be manipulated. So go into the event graph. Let's get rid of these variables at the moment, and we'll create a new custom event. We'll call it server, because I want this just to run on the server. Remember I said that we want to manipulate the score only on the server, and then we'll replicate it to the clients. So I'll call it server add score, and over here in the replicate section, make sure it runs on the server. And we need an input to this event. So we'll create a new input and we'll call it score to add. So whenever an event happens in the game that we want to add score, it will call this function, pass in the score to add, and we're going to add it to our running total. So this is an integer value. We want to take our player score, so control. So that's the current score that we've got, and then we want to do a plus to add integer and integer, and then we want to set the new player score. So use the Alt key and drag out player score, connect it to the add score event, and connect it to the result of the addition of the existing score and the new score we're adding. So this will keep that player state updated, and we'll be able to at any point in time interrogate that player score to see what the current view is. So if we recap what we've done so far, we've created a widget on the screen with the score. We've created a function to add the score, but we haven't yet decided when that score is going to be added. And so let's compile and save this, and let's go back to our main window. What we want to do is every time we drive through a gate, we want to add a value to that score. Let's just keep it simple and just add 1 every time we go through a gate. So go to our gates folder, go to our gate blueprint, and if you remember, this is where we got to last time with this. Every time that we overlapped the gate collision, we made sure we were running on the server, and we spawned a new gate and destroyed the current gate. What we want to do now is we want to add the score, and let's have a think where we're going to do that add score. I guess we could go directly to the player state, but I'd quite like to go through the player controller, so it's sort of obvious the player controller has the logic for what's happening at any point in time in the game. So we want to create a bit of logic in between here and the spawn the new gate that adds a score. But before doing that, we need to create an event on the player controller to add the score. So let's go back to our player controller, and we'll create a new custom event. And I'm going to call this server add score. And we want to run this on the server. Remember, everything to do with score manipulation we're running on the server. And now we need to get the player state in order to add the score. Now luckily, I believe you can just do get player state from the controller. It can determine the player state associated with this controller, and then we can simply do our add score. Now I can't find it here, and again this is because this is looking at the default player state object. Remember, we created a custom player state object, so what we need to do first of all is we need to cast this to my player state so that we've got our custom object with the custom function. So let's do that first. And now, as the custom player state, we can do add score. So there's our server add score function. And for now, I'll just hard code the value of 1 for the score to add. Later on, we might want to have different scores for different gates, but let's keep it pretty simple at the moment. So that has added the score to the server. The other thing we probably want to do now is to show the updated score on the screen. So let's create another custom event. And this time this is going to run on the client, so we'll say client, zoom in a bit, show score. And we want to show the score on our widget. Remember when we created when we started the game, we showed the widget and stored the my score widget variable. So let's drag that in. And if you drag off here and show update score, that was the function we created earlier, we can attach that. And so update score wants a score input. So our score, where is our score input? Well, we've created that on the player state. So we need to retrieve it from the player state. So player state, and remember from before, we cast it to our custom player state. I could have copied it from above, but let's just create it again. So let's connect that, move that along a bit, move this up, and from the custom player state we can get the player score that we updated here, and that is what we'll plug in to the score here. So probably need to tidy up these lines in a minute, but that'll probably be fine for now. So let's recap. We're adding the score to the player state, and then in this event here we're going to show the score from my player state and update it on the widget. The only thing is that there's nothing calling this client show score at the moment. So you might be tempted to think, well, once I've added the score here, why don't I call that client show score at that point in time? In fact, let's make sure that this event here, I didn't do this, runs on the owning client. So we don't want it run on the server, we want it run on the client. And there's something else we need to do as well. Do you remember our error we made here? We were not checking it was a local player controller. This might be a bit confusing, but the player controller client runs on the actual client and also on the server. If you remember the diagram I showed you, it showed where that existed. So we also need to check that it's the local player controller before we do this. So let's move these along a bit, and let's just copy these two nodes here, paste them in here, and make sure that it's true. So we're checking it's local player controller, and if it is local player controller, we'll get the player state, get the player score, and show it on the widget. So the last thing I want to do is, after adding the score here, is call that client show score. And so every time we update the score, we'll call this and show the updated score. So let's try it out, see what happens. So let's compile and save it and play. Okay, let's start off with the server. So we will go through the gate. Nothing's happened. Okay, nothing's happened there either. So let's follow our logic and see what we did from the sort of start to the end. So let's go to our gate. We haven't added the score yet, so no wonder nothing's happening. We created that event in the player controller to add the score, but we didn't actually call it. when the gate has been run through. So that's what we need to add here. So remember, we've wanted to check it's a server first. Let's move that out of the way. So the first thing is the other actor tells me what's gone through the gate, and we're only expecting pickup trucks to go through the gate. So the first thing I want to do is take this other actor node and cast to my pickup, sorry, so the vehicle. So that's the first thing. Next thing we want to do is we want to get the controller for this pickup, so we can draw out here, get controller, and then we want to make sure that we're using our custom controller. So take this controller and cast to BP my player controller. And again, I need to create a bit more space here. And we only want to do that if it is a pickup, which it should be. And from the player controller, we now can call that add score on the server. So that was our add score function. And once we've done that, then we'll spawn a new gate and destroy the existing gate. So let's follow the logic now before we test it. We're making sure the gate has been overlapped. We're making sure we're running on the server, casting to the vehicle, getting the controller, making sure we get the my player controller custom version, and then calling the add score. If I go to add score, it gets my custom player state and adds the score to it. So the current score was 0, then it'll add 1, and then the next time it calls it, it'll go from 1 to 2. And then finally, once it's added the score, it calls the client event to show the score on the local player controller, gets the player state score, and then calls the widget to update the score. Sounds good. Let's compile and save everything. Go into play mode, and let's start off on the server. Let's find the gate, drive through it. Hopefully this should work this time. Yeah, so the score incremented to 1. Let's go through the gate again. Score 2. So seems to be working on the server. Will it work on the client? So let me go over to the client. Let's find the next gate. So score is 0 on the client, and when I go through the gate, it stays as 0. And that's what I expected, for a very good reason, which is that although we've updated everything correctly, the player state, the variable that we created, player score, is not being replicated. So the player score is being updated on the server, and then it's staying on the server. So what we need to do is we need to replicate this to the player states on the client so that they can be read by the event that's showing the widget. So you probably think, let's just change it to replicated, and that'll sort the problem out. So let's compile and save. And what you'll notice when we go into play mode is something a bit strange happens, and I'll show you what happens, and then I'll explain why it's happening and how we fix it. So let's go to the client view. Let's make it a bit bigger. Right, so client view. Get myself the right way up first of all. Bit of collision there. I think later on we'll spawn these things in more random locations so we don't have that collision. Right, so I'm going to go through this first gate. So the score is 0, and after I go through, the score is still 0. And you're thinking, that's a bit strange. We've replicated the variable, so why isn't it showing it? Let's go through it again. and now the score is 1, and you might think, oh well, it maybe just didn't work first time. What happens if we go through again? If I can actually stay on track. Score goes up to 2. Let me tell you what's happening here and why it might be a bit confusing. If we go to the player controller where we added the score, we came into this server event and we did the add score. That added the score to the existing player score, which is set to replicated. And then we then go back to the player controller. We then said let's show the score on the client. So we got the player state, we got the player score, and then we updated it. The problem is that this is running probably before that player score has actually been replicated. So the reason why it was showing the score of 1, 0, 1 and 2 rather than 1, 2, 3 is that it was showing the score prior to the event being fired. So what we really need to do is somehow delay this client show score until the player score has actually been replicated. And luckily the Unreal Engine developers thought of this function and thought that's exactly what you need, and they've created a function called rep notify rather than replication, which allows you to replicate and then let the system know once that variable has been replicated to the client. So let us go back to the player state, go to our player score variable, and instead of the replicated option here, let's choose rep notify. And what happens is it creates a function called onRepPlayerScore, and that function effectively will be called once that player score has been replicated. So we could use this to then call the client update. So let's go back to our player controller. So we don't want to do this anymore, where we show the score. And I've seen so many tutorials where people just put delays in order to wait for that, but it's not the right way of doing it, because you've already got a function which will tell you when the score's ready. So you may as well have it properly event driven and call it at the right time. So let's go back to my player state, our new rep notify function, open it up, and now what we can do is we can use this to call the update. So what we need to do is get the player controller, and if you're not in the player controller, getting player controller 0 in a multiplayer game will get my player controller, and then from this we need to cast to my player controller version. So let's connect that, and then finally we can call the client show score function. So what will happen is that it will call this onRepPlayerScore function using rep notify when the player score has been replicated, and that's when we'll show the score, and we know that the score has been replicated to the client player state, so it should be in there. So let's test that out. Compile and save, go into play mode, let's go on to the client. Gate's quite close by, so let's go through it, and I'm expecting now when we go through the gate the score updates immediately, because it waited until it got that rep notify event and then it called the client update. So score 1, score 2, you might have noticed there was a delay there of about half a second, and that's because there is a parameter that allows you to set how frequently it replicates. So we'll go and change that in a moment. We ought to check that it works on the server as well. So let's go back to the server and go through. This should be fine. That's working as well, because the onRep notify also works on the listen server client as well. So that's all working fine. So let's look at this variable that tells how often it's replicated, so that it's a little bit more snappy in executing that event. Let's go to the my player state, and there doesn't seem to be anything here on the player score about how often it works, but if we go to the actual My Player State event, under replication there's this update frequency, and it's saying how often per second this is going to be replicated. So it's one time per second, so it's going to be any time between sort of 0 and 1 seconds, the lag. So we could update this to, it's not going to happen very often. Let's do it to 10, so that it should be within 100 milliseconds. Compile that, and let's give that a go. Let's go to the client, go through the gate. Yeah, and it's more snappy now. It updated the score almost immediately. As I said, it's doing it 10 times a second now. And updated. So it seems a long-winded way of just showing my player score, and yes, we could have done this in a much simpler way if we were just showing the score on the client, but what we've actually done here is set up a really good solid foundation for next week's episode, where I'm going to show you the multiplayer scoreboard so we can see everybody's score on everybody's screen. So as always, I hope you found this helpful. Stay safe as always, and I hope to see you next week for the next part of multiplayer scoring, where we'll talk about putting a multiplayer scoreboard on every player's screen. See you next time. Bye for now.